Time now for a closer look at some of the big stories of the week with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have State Senator Jen Plumb and former House Speaker Greg Hughes. Great to have both of you on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Let's get into really one of the big stories of the week, and that is this high-stake negotiation playing out in the nation's capital on the debt ceiling. We're approaching default. I want to get into the consequences potentially of that, but first, as lawmakers, specifically the president and Republican leaders, look to negotiate on this issue, our debt in the neighborhood of $32 trillion. That's a number most of us can't even comprehend. What approach should they take heading into that? Senator, let's start with you.
You know, it's been a fascinating kind of dialogue and situation unfolding for me to watch as someone who just went through a session and watched our state try to keep our budget balanced, try to figure out our priorities, but also hopefully listen to one another across the proverbial aisles to do what we think is right by Utahns. And so it's frustrating for me to watch this kind of end of days sort of scenario where folks throw around, well, I guess we just won't fund it. I guess we'll shut it down. It doesn't sit well with me. I think that we're bigger than that. We're better than that. And actually what the citizens need is something way more thoughtful than that. So for me, I'm learning a lot and hopefully learning what I don't want to see happen here ever.
Greg, your thoughts on how lawmakers should approach this issue?
I love Senator Plumb draws a great comparison between a state legislature where you don't print money and you have to balance budgets and you have to work with each other and there's negotiations and discussions versus the brinkmanship that you're seeing in Washington, D.C., where I'd say if you're in a hole, you got to quit digging. And the spending is going, you have to keep raising the debt ceiling when there's no attention to whether you're ever going to slow down spending. So I think there was a calculated decision by the Biden administration that they didn't think the House of Representatives with such a five-person Republican majority would ever come to any kind of agreement to even come to a table to negotiate. Well, that's happened, and now it's time to negotiate. That has happened in the past. You go back to the Reagan and Tip O'Neill years where there were negotiations on budgets and decisions. And as the senator pointed out, it's what I used to do and what public servants across this country do. They sit across the table and they hammer out agreements, find common ground. It's not perfect, but it's common ground. Washington, D.C. has to start doing those types of things and start being leaders and quit staring at these Armageddon scenarios of debt ceilings or debt failure or anything like that.
Okay. Along with the Republicans in the House, we've seen senators get behind this plan as well. One of them, our own Senator Mike Lee, backing this plan in the House. But let's talk about the arguments we're hearing from both sides. Republicans are saying, look, we need to chip away at what we're spending. In other words, cut some of this spending. The president's saying not raising the debt limit is just off the table. We can't take that approach, according to him. Senator, what are some areas, potentially, if any, you could see some cuts at the federal level? Where could we cut spending?
Well, and I think that that's one of the key pieces isn't it so funny to watch folks go into these dialogues having predetermined, nope, it's this or nothing, or we cut this or nothing. Where are those dialogues about having an honest reflection? Where is our spending? Where is our proverbial return? If any of us were running a business, where's the return on our investment here and there? I personally think that having watched through my admittedly state-focused lens, not federal lens, that there are a lot of spaces where we could do some trimming. I think that there's some tightening spaces. You know, I think as much as I am a supporter of our men and women in service, I do think that the way our military spending has been run for quite a long while has not been efficient. I also do think that the bureaucracy that exists across agencies, and I have to believe both federal and state agencies can look at these, that the bureaucracies and the spending that happen there, we can do some tightening up there without saying, nope, no more green this, or without saying, nope, no more this. Where is the big picture fix for me? And I think, too, that's what I feel like is missing when I watch what's happening federally, is these hard dialogues where folks come in with an opinion from each side and say, well, where's the middle? Because somewhere in there is probably the sweet spot, no matter how much any of us wants to think, whether we're right, left, liberal, conservative, that our opinion is the best and only right one. Somewhere closer to the middle is probably closer to the reality.
Let me ask you this real quick before we move on to Greg. Should entitlement programs potentially be on the chopping block?
Boy, that's a rough discussion, right? And that's when you're trying to get me some emails from that one, coming at it with that one. But do I think they should?
If you don't get emails after the show, it was not a success.
That's right. We haven't had a good dialogue. That's good. No, I think, should we blanketly say, yep, entitlements, cutting by blank? Absolutely not. But should we have an evaluation of where there could be some trimming that could happen, some streamlining, or how about some refocusing? Like, there are areas I think we could absolutely get better results out of. We just perhaps haven't unearthed all of them. And I believe that both state and federally. I think it's true in both spaces.
Greg, should cuts be made to our spending? And if so, which ones?
Absolutely. In fact, your viewers need to know there's probably more discussion happening on this program right now about how you would come to an agreement than actually the Biden administration and Congress are having with each other. Some of the proposals, or the proposals that the House put forward, wasn't even cuts. They were, okay, let's just increase spending by just 1% a year. They weren't even talking cuts. And you had a Biden administration and a president that was saying, we're not going to do this brinkmanship. You're not going to hold the debt ceiling over our head to have any negotiation. We won't participate in that. And only this last week has the president agreed to appoint 2 people to start speaking with Speaker McCarthy at the House about what they passed. Some of the spending cuts are really just slowing down the spending that you're seeing happening at such a high rate. And those are discussions worth having. And it does apply to our debt ceiling because that's why you have a debt ceiling. Let's just get rid of the ceiling. Why have one if every time you bump up against it, you just want to automatically raise it without any discussion of how you got there? So as you listen to the senator and we talk about these things, we're having that discussion that sadly I don't think they're having at all. Or at least the relevant parties aren't in D.C., and that's really what has to change. And I think that's going to take collectively the neutral ground of all Americans to say, we're not happy with what we're watching. It's a circus, and it's hurting us and our younger kids.
So weigh in specifically on where you think cuts could be made potentially.
So I would say this, one of the great proposals that I like in the House, and again, it's actually measured in how they get there, is in 1996 you saw a welfare reform plan that was passed by a Newt Gingrich Congress, signed by President Bill Clinton, and it put some time parameters on assistance, unemployment, things like that. They're looking at putting time measures back into unemployment benefits, some of these benefits that people get where it's for a certain amount of time. When they did that back in 96 and they implemented that, they saw the welfare rolls cut in half, they saw employment grow. Some of those, again, I'm not even saying you're slashing or cutting anything, but you're putting those parameters on. There's been success in our country when those policies were put in place back in 96. We've gotten away from them as a country. Some of the big provisions, growing 1% a year, and even putting those time limits back into those welfare benefits or assistance, those are positives that I would go to before we start talking draconian cuts. Certainly, entitlements are a buzzword. That's a way to scare people out of any discussion.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, so we're kind of taking this back generations of politicians, and we've seen the debt grow astronomically since that time. What are the consequences of the debt that we're facing now as we continue to just potentially kick the can down the road to further generations? And is that even realistic to think that the national government can one day have a balanced budget? Senator.
Well, you'd sure hope it's not unrealistic, right? And I actually, as I was driving this morning listening to a piece on talk radio about it, and I had that moment of fleeting thought in my head of like, remembering learning about, well, why can't the government just print more money? Or why can't the government just say, oh, look, there's more money in my bank account? Or there's more, we have more to spend. And I remember learning that part of the stability that is our nation is that we do not do that. We don't go the way of some of the developing countries. We've seen it happen in Central American countries. We've seen it happen in European countries where all of a sudden their dollar is completely devalued. And there you lose your economy, you lose your jobs, you lose your health, you lose your wealth, all of that sort of thing. And I think that honestly, we've heard these balanced budget dialogues as long as I remember, as back to being a teen and learning about the concept of it. Do I think it's really going to be a thing? I would like to hope, but I do have my doubts because it doesn't seem like there's any feet to the fire to make it actually happen. And I agree with former Speaker Hughes. What is a ceiling if a ceiling just keeps getting raised? We have to set it out to actually be successful that way.
Okay, we only have about 3 minutes left. I really want to get to another topic. Greg, is there anything really quick you want to finish up on?
Just shout out to President Clinton, to Senator Plum's party. he balanced that budget. He did it with
Words
a
I
Newt
have never
Gingrich.
heard on this program.
I've never
come
said
from
it.
Greg Hughes.
She's catching me at a good time.
We're good for one another, apparently.
You had a Newt Gingrich Republican Congress, and you had President
That's
Clinton, and
fair.
they balanced the budget. It can happen. Absolutely can happen. Takes
Good
leadership.
point.
That's fair.
Okay,
That's fair.
let's get into the opioid overdose crisis that we see in the country here in our state as well. However, some very significant improvement here in the state. Death rates, some data, interesting data that Senator, you provided to me from KFF, showing us that back in 2012, we were the 4th highest state in the country. 11 years later, 9 years later, I should say, in 2021, 42nd. That's a huge improvement. How did that happen?
I'll tell you, it's actually great that we get to talk about this with the former speaker and myself. That's how we became